This passage, along with its parallels in Matthew and Luke, is one of only 4 narratives in the New Testament that deals with the healing of leprosy. The word leprosy comes from the Greek word leptein, to peel off. Scholars tell us that it is probably not the modern disease of leprosy that today we call Hansen's disease, but it could have referred to a wide variety of common skin disorders that we are familiar with today. Psoriasis, eczema, vitiligo, ringworm, lupus, some of these more serious than others. And today we have many remedies for these kinds of skin diseases, as we witness every evening in the many commercials for them around the time of the evening news. The book of Leviticus, chapters 13 and 14, from which today's first reading is taken, tomorrow's first reading, gives graphic description of these diseases and the quarantine measures that were required for those afflicted with them. And we can be grateful that the lectionary has abbreviated the passage from Leviticus. It's pretty daunting what it goes into. The Hebrew term sara'at is used in other places in Leviticus to describe this condition, which can also be a fungus, which can affect fabrics and surfaces. I think something that we are all too familiar with in terms of our situation in the current pandemic. The law considered persons who had this skin disease unclean. And if such a diagnosis was confirmed by the priest, the victims were to wear torn up clothes, disheveled hair, and they were required to live outside of the camp. In other words, they were banished from the community. Any physical contact with such persons would also render the person who came into contact with them unclean. So these afflicted had to cry out, unclean, unclean, if they saw anyone approaching them on the road. The pale skin that they had gave the impression that the person who had skin disease was near death. And in fact, the isolation that such persons experienced, being banished from living in the community, was something like a living death. And I think we can appreciate in this time of pandemic, when we too are prohibited from contact with people that we love, whether they not yet have been vaccinated, whether they are in hospital and without necessarily COVID-19, but we are prevented from visiting those who are close to us, who are in hospital for one reason or another. There are references to cures of leprosy in other places in the Hebrew Bible, and these were considered miraculous, something like being raised from the dead. You find them in the book of Numbers and in the second book of Kings. Last week, the lectionary presented us with the curing of Peter's mother-in-law, after which Jesus, quote, cured many who were sick with various diseases and drove out many demons. We are told at the end of that pericope that we were told that the whole town was gathered at the door. So we know that he was in Capernaum, in the house of Simon and Andrew. We were also told that Jesus would not permit the demons he drove out to speak, and that the following morning he went out to a deserted place and prayed. The disciples hunted him down, and when they found him, said, "Everyone is searching for you." So Jesus acquiesces and says, "This is the purpose for which I have come." And so he set out for the neighboring towns, going throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. This last section of chapter 1 of Mark's gospel is characterized by the typically Markan emphasis on the constant movement of Jesus, and gives us a sense of the urgency in his proclamation that the reign of God was imminent and that there was no time to lose. Given this ending of last week's gospel, our passage today seems rather awkwardly placed. And next week, we will return again to the beginning of Mark's gospel with the scene of the temptation in the desert as we begin the first Sunday of Lent. As our friend and colleague John Donahue in his commentary on this passage notes, the healing of the leper is the only such healing of this disease in Mark's gospel. We are not given a specific location for it, but for Donahue, it is the most vivid of the narratives of Jesus's healings, the most vivid that is presented thus far, at least in Mark. We are told that the leper comes to Jesus begging him, in the Greek, parakalon, begging him, imploring and kneeling, gonepeton, falling on his knees. This word kneeling, Donahue says, may have been added later by the early church in order to correspond with Matthew, who has the leper kneel, and to Luke, who actually has him prostrate. In any case, it renders the scene dramatically. The leper believes that if Jesus wills or chooses, the Greek theles, he can make him clean. The Greek word used here that is translated can or make is dunasai, to have power, which suggests again to Donahue that there's an implicit Christology here, namely that Jesus embodies the power and the will of God. Since only divine intervention could have brought about a cure, the cleansing of leprosy, for the cleansing of leprosy. Mark tells us that Jesus is moved with pity. And this is a verb in Greek that I'm sure I'm going to murder. And I'm glad that our other biblical scholars are here. But I love to try to say it anyway. Blanchnithes or splanchtnithes, a word that designates affection or emotion. And in the Hebrew anthropology, it means from the guts, often translated as heart. Having been moved with compassion, he stretched out his hand, ektenas, and touched him. This is clearly dramatic. And if one compares the action of Jesus with the curing of Naaman the leper in the second book of Kings, who's cleansed when only following Elisha's command to wash in the Jordan River 7 times, it emphasizes that Jesus is making a statement about what is unclean, since he clearly disregards the imputation that now he is also unclean for having touched someone who is unclean. Donahue tells us that Jesus's response, I do choose, or I will it, means that the healing is accomplished by Jesus's word, rather than simply by the action of touching. Mark goes on to use one of his favorite words, and I was delighted to hear this so strongly emphasized when we were giving the words that struck us. Immediately, euthys, to describe how the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. After sternly warning him, embrymisamenos in Greek, which Donahue translates as with a deep groan, seeing that the word literally means snorting or growling, perhaps more suited to exorcisms when demons are cast out. And yet this creates a problem. Why would Jesus cast out someone that he has just touched? And it's a troubling word because that person is still present and not cast out. So when Jesus says, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer what Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony, Donahue clearly agrees with those scholars who see this word, groaning, snorting, as emanating from an earlier tradition, which may have seen a closer connection with illness and demonic possession. This injunction to say nothing to anyone is also puzzling, since Jesus is telling him to go to see the priest. Showing oneself to the priest was not a trivial thing. Leviticus 13 and 14 tell us of an elaborate ritual that often included sacrifices of birds and animals, and we're given special instructions for those who are poor, who cannot afford such animals. In any case, such a sacrificial offering meant that this was something public, and so this cleansing would have been known. The end of the passage is also dramatic, since despite Jesus' solemn command, "Be silent," the man disobeys and begins to proclaim it freely. Here again the Greek word, diaphemizine ton logon, meaning broadcasting the word or telling what happened to him, is very significant and dramatic. Then our passage closes with the result that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, yet people came to him from every quarter. So I think there are so many resonances in this gospel passage for tomorrow with our own experiences. And perhaps I am going to be overemphasizing our current context of pandemic and quarantine, but certainly the fears that many of us have of contagion from the virus are certainly similar to the way the disease of leprosy was regarded during the time of Jesus and perhaps also during the time of Mark's writing. The hope of being cleansed by from the COVID-19 virus by means of the vaccine is surely on the minds of many of us. How many conversations have you been in where the questions are, were you able to get your shot yet? Or have you gotten your second shot? Or complaints about your state not opening up enough sites, or the lack of vaccines, or the slowness in moving on to the next eligible group of people. Yes, I think we can identify, certainly with the experience of quarantine, which was actually much more brutal with regard to leprosy, almost like a living death. And even if it is no longer mandated by your state, it remains a very common occurrence in the day-to-day world I live in, as I can testify from teaching college students who often email me that they're now in quarantine after having come in contact with someone else who tested positive by means of our tracing mechanisms that are operational on campus. And even today, tennis fans who were about to have the chance to be in person witnessing the Australian Open have now been told that due to an outbreak in one of the hotels where the players were sequestered, will no longer be admitted. But the games will go on. However, even before COVID-19, we have had in place social exclusions that were based upon conditions that one had no choice about. Skin color or race, biological sex, being female, sexual orientation, LGBTQ plus question mark, or economic status, the poverty and possible eviction that has been brought about by losses of job, failure to be able to pay mortgages. How can someone be cleansed from these ostracizations? Clearly, it has to do with a fundamental denial or recognition of one's basic humanity. Yesterday, in our doctoral seminar at Boston College, I had to respond to one of our students, an African-American man who was presenting a paper that he hoped to submit to a journal devoted to Black theology. He was arguing that the African-American preacher, Howard Thurman, owed his foundational religious experience that every person is a child of God to his grandmother, Nancy Ambrose. She was a daughter of slaves, and my student felt that she needed to be recognized as a kind of proto-womanist that is a Black feminist theologian, for whom Thurman credited for his own understanding of his vocation. Now, Howard Thurman has been credited with expressing the philosophical framework for the civil rights movement, particularly in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, a book that was a significant influence on Martin Luther King, who carried it in his briefcase wherever he traveled. It was also an inspiration to other Black leaders like Jesse Jackson, Vernon Jordan, and John Lewis. Thurman, although well-educated, did not like to think of himself as a theologian, but as a preacher, and yes, even a mystic. If you can, perhaps you've already seen the film by Martin Doblmeier, available online, called Backs Against the Wall, you'll learn all about Howard Thurman. I'm ashamed that although I have sent cards with quotation from Thurman out to people, I did not really realize his significance for Black theology until I saw that film. It was Thurman's commitment to nonviolence and to contemplation that changed Martin Luther King. And in fact, Thurman was not simply an activist, but a contemplative who appreciated silence and prayer, and who owed much to his involvement in contemplative action with Quaker theology and his meeting with Mahatma Gandhi. It was Thurman who made for many Black activists the connection between contemplation and social justice. My student's point was that what Thurman had learned from his grandmother, Nancy, a daughter of slaves, that she was a child of God, was the basis of Thurman's mysticism. She learned this from a Black preacher who ended every sermon with, "You are not slaves, you are God's children." And therefore, for her, for Thurman, for the other Black activists, whether from race, sex, class, sexual orientation, the conviction of being a child of God could not be taken away. So in my mind, the leper who comes to Jesus, seeking but already believing that Jesus has the power to cleanse him, seems to know this intuitively, or at least he carries a desperate hope based upon what he may have heard. Unfortunately, the social seclusions of our age do not encourage a climate that breeds such intuition. In his book, Let Us Dream, The Path to a Better Future, one that I'm just starting to get into, Pope Francis recounts his experiences in the Plaza of the Constitution when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, when he would celebrate masses every July, specifically for the exploited people on the margins. And the Pope writes that he saw these persons gathered on the plaza as persons like the people who followed Jesus, a people with a history, with a hope, and who were safeguarding a promise. And I quote now from Let Us Dream. "The people that Jesus met always hold in their hearts a promise, an invitation that leads them toward what they desire, despite the exclusion they suffer. Jesus' preaching evoked in them ancient promises they carried in their guts, in their blood, an ancestral awareness of God's closeness and of their own dignity. By bringing to them that closeness in the way he spoke and touched and healed, Jesus showed that awareness was real. He opened for them a path of hope into the future, a path of liberation that was not merely political, but something more, a human liberation that conferred that dignity that only God can give. And that's why they followed Jesus," Francis says. He gave them dignity. So now Lent is just around the corner. And I want to suggest that we ponder this gospel in preparation for Lent and not just think about what we are going to give up, but maybe think about the people whom we know who are actually excluded and treated as lepers. What will we do this Lent to make them feel welcome? What have we done or are we still doing that foster the separations that cause exclusion? How can we let people know, the people in our own orbits or bubbles, or even the strangers that we may encounter, that they are a child of God? And let us think about this as we hear also Paul tell us in the reading tomorrow from the first letter to the Corinthians, where Paul says, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ."